All right, well, we're going to get started. Thank you for joining us online as we get started with our Bible class tonight. Thanks for those that are in the room. I'm going to go through our prayer request and also our announcement sheet, and then we'll get started with our time tonight. Many on our prayer request are recurring that we just continue to pray for all the time. Brian Hatley continues to have issues. James Jones continues to have issues, but he's we're going to get started right now, undergoing tests to figure out what's going on with him. Thank you for joining us online. Shep Knight continues to have issues and is still in the hospital, but is improving and hopefully might get to go home on Friday. John Rowden continues to have issues, but responded this past week and is thankful for that we just continue to pray for all the time. Scalzo continues Brian Hatley continues to have issues, continues to have ongoing issues. Two new prayer requests would be Sharon Sicarella is Teresa Frazier's sister who fell and is in the ICU in New Orleans with a brain bleed. And then the Tingles, who have been visiting with us for a while, they request prayers for their adoption journey and that the Lord would bless them with perfect timing and that everything would go smoothly with that. Those are all the prayer requests that I have, so let me just briefly mention a couple of announcements. We are no longer taking attendance manually, so that goes for Wednesday nights and all the services on Sunday. So we ask that you please register your attendance with us, whether you're online or at home. That helps us to know who all's watching and keep track of those things. You can, if you're here on a Wednesday, you could log in to the attendance form from this past Sunday or last week and use that, or the QR code. Wayne and Ashley Bells had their new baby, Bentley, and there is a Take Them a Meal that has been set up. The recipient name is Bells, B-A-L-E-S, and the password is OCTLC. So Oliver Creek TLC, OCTLC is the password. And then there's a final note to save the date for May 2nd, which will be our next blood drive at Oliver Creek. So that's all that I have. So let's open up with a word of prayer tonight. Father, we thank you so much for this time that we have to be together as a church family tonight to study and to think about how we can better share the good news of Jesus Christ with our world. We're thankful for those that are here and those that are watching online. We're thankful that we still get to be united in our dedication to Jesus Christ, even though many of us are still having to participate from a distance. We have many members that are sick and dealing with very serious health issues. We continue to lift up those that we pray for on a regular basis, for people like Brian Hatley, for Shep Knight, for James Jones and John Rowden and Ann Scalzo and Zach Wilson. Tonight we also pray for Teresa Frazier's sister who's battling for her life, that you would be with Teresa as she's caring for her, and that you would be with the Tingles in their adoption journey, and that you would help everything to go smoothly, and that you would be present in every step of that process. We pray tonight that you open our minds to give us understanding, and that you open our hearts to help us to know better how we can reach those around us that are lost, and how we can be effective sharers of your gospel in the way that we live and in the way that we communicate with our world. And pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. Let me start us off with a scripture reading, and then we will turn to what we're going to do tonight. For though I am free with respect to all, I have made myself a slave to all, so that I might win more of them. To the Jews I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law, I became as one outside the law, though I'm not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law, so that I might win those outside the law. To the weak, I became weak, so that I might win the weak. I've become all things to all people, that I might by all means save some. I do it for the sake of the gospel, so that I may share in its blessings. Those words from Paul are what we're trying to do right now. Is we want to be effective missionaries for the gospel, and so we are thinking about to a secular age, I became as one who lived in a secular age. And how can we reach people around us better? So let me tell you what we're going to do tonight. Last week, as quickly as I went, we didn't get to finish. So I'm going to backtrack just a little bit, kind of review what we did last week. If you didn't get to participate in that, I'm really sorry. You'll just have to go back and watch it. We're going to finish, and the last little bit is, I think, where in a secular age you begin to find some open doors to share the gospel with people, and then some kind of conclusions. And hopefully we're going to have plenty of time left over. I definitely do not plan to take up the whole time. And then Logan's going to come up and we're going to do a kind of Q&A together. And what I'm hoping in that Q&A is, I think a lot of people have questions about, like, where are all the young people in church? What's going on with the younger generations? And so maybe there's questions that this material has kind of spurred in your mind. And so we're just going to do our best to maybe field some of those questions together. If there are no questions, we've got a couple things we could just talk about with each other, and everyone's eavesdropping on our conversation. So anyway, we'll have fun there at the very end. Last week we talked about how to understand secularism and how to understand a secular age, and we walked through kind of the historical explanation for how we got to where we got today. And the major question that the philosopher Charles Taylor is trying to address is, how do you go from 1500, where belief in God was not up for debate, there was no one that couldn't believe in God, to where you now, just 500 years later, it's difficult in our culture to believe in God. So how did that happen? Go back and listen to last week, because we did all that. But what we basically said was, disenchantment is, over the last 500 years, what's happened with the rise of the Enlightenment and a lot of other factors. We removed the need for ghosts and spirits and demons and demon possession, and God is what's happened in the West. That you find all these natural explanations to explain stuff, and this is called a disenchanted world, where you take enchantment out of the world. But the other major factor that we looked at that's happened in the West is, if you could be possessed by a demon, it was dangerous to live in 1500. The enchanted world was dangerous for people. And what we did in the West was we retreated from being in danger from external forces to the inside. So we moved our identities inside of us, and we became individualists. And really, there's kind of a Greek precedent for this. It's Platonism. It's very similar to that, where you say our body is just a shell for the true me, and the true me is on the inside. And last week when we talked about this, I could see some light bulbs going on. Like, this helps me understand a lot of things that are happening in our world when we think about how radically we have retreated into individualism and what that means. Another thing that happened with that was we elevated our ability to reason and know, so that the highest kind of thing that we valued was our own enlightenment and our own minds and our own intellectual ability to know everything. And we also, individualism, we also believed that God made the creation for us. So we became very me-centered and human-centered. And so these were some of the things we spent the whole hour last week kind of unpacking. But here's now that we have seen those two things historically that have led us to this moment, here's the places where I think there's doors open for the gospel. And we did some of this last week, so some of this will be a little bit familiar. But in a secular age that's disenchanted, that has removed God or anything transcendent, and everyone is living by their own identities, their own individual kind of self-fulfillment, and I'm supposed to make myself happy, then where does a secular age find meaning? Where do they find purpose and meaning in their life? What do they wake up in the morning to do? And so, two of the realities we have to understand about our new situation is we are now in a pluralized society where there's an array of options. There's an array of options to choose for your religion if you want to have one, or just be spiritual in general. There's an array of options that you can choose for yourself to make yourself happy. There's a lot of ways you can go out and try to fulfill your own desires. It is a pluralized society. And one of the things that Taylor argues is that when you are living around so many different options, what happens is nobody believes any single option very strongly. That when you're around a lot of people of different faiths, you don't want to be, what'd you say? You don't want to be extreme. You don't want to be an extremist, right? You don't want to stand out, and you don't want to make it look like you think everybody else is bad, so you just kind of back off your Christian faith. It becomes kind of this inner thing, right? And so he calls this fragilization. And what happens in a secular society, because there's so many options, everybody's kind of walking around going, am I right? Am I right? A lot of these other people over here believe something very different from me, and they believe it very ardently. What if they're right? So he says in our society, everybody's kind of walking around with these really existential questions. Everybody in a secular age has things and doubts that comes up. So one of the common stories you'll hear among Christians that I shared with you all, my own story on Sunday morning 2 Sundays ago, is you'll hear a lot of Christians who go through a period of doubt. I went through this period where I was questioning the religious faith that my parents handed to me. Is Christianity really true? I need to examine the evidence for myself, and here's what I've decided for myself. Like, that's a very popular Christian story. But here's the thing about that. That's not just something, here's what Taylor shows, that's not just something that you hear a lot among Christians. That's actually something you hear among everybody who's living in a secular age. Let me share with you one other quote. So, Julian Barnes, he lives in secular England. He's an old dude now. He may be past, but he's really into literature. He's a really, really smart dude. And he's never been a Christian. He's never been religious at all. And he writes this book called Nothing to be Frightened of, because he's at things like his mother's funeral, and he's like, what does life mean? And how does a person like me who doesn't have any belief in God, how do I cope with the death of my mother? And like, what gives my life meaning? And the real question that he wrestles with a lot is, the real question he wrestles with a lot is, what about death? Like, what happens at death? And that kind of makes him afraid. So here's his book on Death is Nothing to be Frightened of. Here's how to think. But here is a person who's not a believer at all, who says this: if I called myself an atheist at 20 and an agnostic at 50 and 60, it isn't because I've acquired more knowledge in the meantime. I've just acquired more awareness of ignorance. How can we be sure that we know enough to know? As 21st century neo-Darwinian materialists, convinced that the meaning and mechanism of life have been fully clear since the year 1859, we hold ourselves categorically wiser than those credulous knee-benders who, just a speck of time away, believed in divine purpose, an ordered world, resurrection, and a last judgment. But although we are more informed, we are no more evolved, and certainly no more intelligent than them. What convinces us that our knowledge is so final? This is an interesting, so you have the Christians who are saying, am I really right? But then you have all the atheists and the agnostics and the materialists saying, am I really right? And what he's saying is, are we so arrogant to think that until Darwin in 1859, that now we, of all people who have ever lived in human history, like we're the only ones to know truth? He's like, we could be wrong. Like people, all humans who have lived just a speck of time away have not believed this. Like, what makes me so arrogant to believe that I know everything? So this is the characteristic that you see in a secular age. Both Christians, both atheists, everybody in a secular age is like, am I right? I'm not 100% sure. But there's doubt that everybody has in a secular age. And let me say something about this. Do you see how this presents a door into the gospel, into our culture? Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I guess it's a question / I don't know if argument's the right word that I've heard before. But people say that if the atheist and agnostic are wrong, then they're obviously going to hell. If we're right or wrong, it's kind of irrelevant because we're going to be in the same place the atheist and agnostic. So I wonder if you think that's an applicable question.
Yeah, so Wes is asking, he's heard people say before, look, if the atheists are wrong, then they've got judgment and hell potentially facing them. But if we're right, then there's a lot on the line if they're wrong, is what he's saying. He's wondering if there's any traction to that argument. My just intuition would say that probably wouldn't hold a whole lot of weight with secular folks. But I do think that this is a doorway into conversations with secular people. Because here's the thing. In our world, nobody feels sure about anything. So when you're talking to people, everybody's kind of walking around with these doubts. And doubts are a way to open up conversations with people. Doubts are a way to start big life conversations that I think everybody in a secular age is kind of walking around with these question mark bubbles above their heads. And those question mark bubbles are entryways into big conversations. But it's not, yes?
But if we believe what we say we believe, we don't have ultimate doubt. I mean, we might have to doubt on this day or during this period, but we believe in the end what we believe and that we are right.
Yes. Yeah, so Stephanie's saying we have to ultimately believe what we believe, although we may go through seasons of doubt and questions. And yeah, I would absolutely agree with you. And what I'm not saying is that, I did go through a period myself, which I shared with everyone, questioning. And so now that I have a sense of what's actually happening in culture around me, and I have a sense of my own beliefs, like I do feel confident in those beliefs to share. But what we're seeing in this is that the vast majority of the people in the West, in the secular age, they don't have that same confidence or that same knowledge of what's happening. They're just sort of drinking this cultural water, and I think walking around with these major question marks. And what I'm saying is, as we think about evangelism, this is a big entryway that we have with a lot of people into those conversations.
I don't know, for me, it seems that if I can't answer all your questions, if you're satisfied someone who's asked me, and I convey to them that I have doubts or have had doubts about certain things or during certain times, then they're not convinced of what I believe.
Okay, so Stephanie's saying, I feel like if I were to tell somebody that I had doubts or have had periods where I wasn't convinced myself, that may indicate to the person that I'm not really sure about what I believe, and it may kind of hinder your conversation with them. And I would actually say it's the opposite. I think that most people in a secular age are really skeptical of anybody who says they have all the answers. I think that actually most people in a secular age, if somebody comes and says, I know everything, and I'm about to tell you all the answers, that's actually off-putting to people. I think that actually, this is why if I were sharing my faith with someone, I think I said it on that Sunday, you don't have to have the bar Elvis vision conversion story. I would say, I went through a period where I had questions, but here's the evidence that I came to believe for myself. This is a constant wrestling for me too, to where I'm trying to learn and I'm trying to grow, and I'm not coming to you with all the answers. That I've even had period of doubt myself or questioning, and I want to share that with you and kind of where I landed on that.
It would be misleading to say that you've never
Right.
found it out, because everyone has.
Yes. Yeah, so Stephanie's saying it would be misleading to not say that you've had a doubt. But here's another reason that I'm raising this on a church level. A lot of times church is not a place you can talk about doubts. But if Taylor is right, which he is, then there's a huge likelihood that the kids that are raised in church, they're also going to have doubts, because what he shows is this isn't just an atheist thing. This is a kids raised in church thing, because this is a Western secular age thing. Does that make sense? And even Christian kids, they're still part of that Western secular age. So I think this is why we have to talk about this, is because we're not just talking about people outside the church. We're actually talking about our kids inside the church. And one of the worst things that we could do as a church is say, you're not able to question, you're not able to ask these questions because we have all the answers, and well, then they're going to go find that answer somewhere else. So this is why I think we're having this series and having this conversation. I think it's really important if we're talking about keeping our kids, and then also secondarily, reaching our neighbors and family and friends. Yeah. So Taylor says there's not only this doubt thing going on, there's also this malaise. So what he says about the malaise is that when you remove enchantment, like when you remove purpose that comes from God and a purpose that's given to us from outside the universe, that's a pretty big hole that's left that society and a secular culture has to try to fill that hole, because nothing outside myself or outside of the universe is giving me any meaning. Does that make sense? Like, that's a huge hole. So let me just say this already. Do you see how this is a door into the gospel? Like, everybody in a secular age who lives in a disenchanted world is walking around trying to fill this big hole. And so here's what people do to try to fill this loss. They try to, here's the two things. Let me remind you, are two things. Disenchantment, right? Disenchantment means I've lost purpose, I've lost meaning, because there is nothing outside myself or outside the world that's giving me meaning, right? The other one's individualism. And what happens in an individualist world, when we retreat inside of ourselves, we cut ourselves off from everybody else. You know what we become? We become really lonely. So we've lost purpose and we're really lonely. So what do we do to try to fill that hole and to try to fix those things? We have a lot of strategies to try to do that. One is we watch Disney movies and we see that when the last flower falls and Belle gets to do her thing, that the evil beast turns into a prince and you get to live the happily ever after, and there's magic and there's sparkles and there's dancing dishes and candlesticks. And so what we want is to experience that same enchantment, that same like out of this world feeling, that magical feeling, but we seek it through relationships or marriages with other people. This is why also in our culture, this helps me make sense of so much stuff. But when you live in a world that sees relationships as a way to like recover the hole that people lost with God, and when you live as an individualist who's trying to satisfy yourself with your own desires, do you see how we're a divorce culture? Why would you not continue divorcing and seeking your own desire until you can find that magical relationship that's promising to fill the hole that you... But here's the problem. The reason you have to keep divorcing is you're never going to be able to find God, that re-enchantment. You're never going to be able to find that in any marriage that you're in. Does that make sense? Do you see how this kind of helps? So sex is another one. Do you wonder why teens are all turning to sex to kind of fill this need? It's because they want to feel something. They want to feel something outside of themselves that gives their life meaning, and they're really lonely. How would sex be a natural way to answer that problem? Drugs. One way that you can deal with the loss of meaning and purpose and the loneliness that comes with individualism is you could just numb yourself so that you don't have to feel anything, and you plug the hole by numbness. Another one that Taylor actually says is a huge one is that in the West, the romantic movement or romanticism was a major way for the Western world to try to plug the hole that was left by disenchantment. So what happened was people wanted to feel God, they wanted to feel this enchantment, but they didn't believe in God anymore. So you know what they do now? They go to a museum and they stand in front of a painting and they feel that thing. And that feeling that they feel when they're looking at that beauty, that's like trying to plug the hole. You see what I'm saying? That's trying to plug the hole. I gave this illustration last week, but we watch American Idol, and whenever they sing, the judges are just, they're crying. They'll end the performance. That was transcendent. That transcended this world. Do you see? That's what art and music is trying to do, is plug the hole that was left here. Nature. Everybody wonders, like, why are all these young people like going off into the woods and being hippies and tree huggers, and why are all young people environmentalists? Because the scriptures tell us that nature is a great place to encounter God, right? That nature reveals God. And so as young people are now going out into nature, they're plugging the hole that was left. Here's the biggest ones. I want to talk about the two biggest ones for just 1 second. Entertainment and consumerism. Everybody's lost purpose, they've lost meaning, and they feel lonely and depressed and individual. And you know who noticed that better than anybody? A capitalist Western economy that says, you feel like you're missing something and lonely? I'll give you something. I'll give you video games, which the strategy of teens just being sucked into video games is the same strategy of drugs. It's like, I'm just going to not deal with the depression and the loneliness and the huge existential questions. I'm going to numb myself by just vegging out in this video game. But also video games and social media are a way for them to feel connected to the world, right? Or a way to them to plug the hole by feeling like they're participating in something that's greater than themselves, and they're no longer lonely because they have 1,000 friends on Facebook, which I'm way outdated. I don't even know what the kids are using these days. But entertainment came along and said, you don't have anything to live for. You no longer have the Christian calendar and Advent and Christmas and Easter. You no longer have that. I'm going to give you the next release of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, or I'm going to give you the next release of the Avengers thing. And so now your life becomes a cycle of living for the consumerism. And this is one way you plug the hole. See it? And in individualist society, this is how they know they can do it, because we're all living to make ourselves happy anyway. So they just dangle the carrot and we just keep chomping, and this is how we now live our lives, is cycles of entertainment and cycles of consumerism. They've become experts at marketing to a Western, disenchanted, individualist world. But then politics... What'd you say?
I was amazed you came up with Lord of the Rings.
Well, that was my big one. Keith was amazed I came up with Lord of the Rings, but that was a big one for me. Politics and social justice. You want to know why so many kids are in that? It gives them a feeling that they're doing something that is greater than themselves, and they're also connecting with other groups of people on those things. So anyway, look at this list. I mean, do you see how all of these things are strategies that people are trying to make sense of a world in the West in a secular age and plug those holes that are left by disenchantment and individualism? I showed this last week. This is an Alabama football stadium because I grew up going there. But Taylor says we've replaced the church with a sports arena, the temple with the concert hall, the chapel with the museum, and made tourism a new pilgrimage. And so we've converted all of our spaces where formerly you had transcendent experiences to now spaces that are dedicated to what is in front of us, but these things are trying to give us meaning. So in Alabama, growing up, which Ed is an Auburn fan, so he can relate to this. I mean, I remember going to church, like, you didn't plan any church activities in the fall. It would have been silly to plan a youth activity on a Saturday in the fall. Like, the church takes a break from being the church in the fall in Alabama for college football. And these Christians are going to the stadium. They have season tickets. They're going to the stadium every single weekend, and they're filling this hole. They're filling this hole that you get to go and dress like everybody else, and you're all united around this ideology, and you have faith that your team's going to win, and you sing the same songs together, and you say the same chants together, and you have a band, so you have music. I mean, it's just like, this is church. We're just doing it at the football stadium, and you don't have to have the boring sermon. Yeah.
What about the churches that are, whole word I think of Pentecostal? The Spirit moves them to do things.
Yeah. Yeah, so there are pockets where people are trying to recover enchantment, or they're trying to hold on to enchantment. So this is not to say that it's not to say, like, to her Stephanie's point, we're all enchanted. We believe in God, but I don't want to go too off base. But here's, even though we're all enchanted and believe in God, one of the signs of enchantment is that when we have sick people, even in our church that believes in God, believes in the power of prayer, we almost always and almost only pray for God to help the doctors and nurses. Right? And it's because I think a lot of us don't actually expect that God would miraculously heal that person. That's a sign of disenchantment. So even the people in the West who claim to be enchanted, we still are drinking that disenchantment water. Now, I said this last week. Go over to Africa and you've got a sick relative and you ask the church to pray for them. How's that going to be different than just praying for doctors and nurses and shots, right? It's going to heal this person right now, and then we're going to go to their house and pray for 12 hours. That's a society that's really enchanted and really has a strong belief in God. So I want to say that this impacts us even though we still believe in God, if that makes sense. Atheists still want to go to church. Atheists still want to have church, which I think is really interesting. One of the things that you will see, remember when I talked about Julian Barnes earlier? I referenced him, this guy from secular England. Here's the first line of his book. I don't believe in God, but I miss him. He's never believed in God. But this is kind of a common saying that you'll hear among non-believers in a secular age is like, I don't believe in God, but I wish He were real, because it would plug some holes that were plugged before I came to not believe in God. So this is a common kind of trope in a secular age. Now, let me ask you, atheists want to go to church. By the way, atheists, most people that we're talking about in the secular age, they're not atheists. Atheists are actually a very small portion of the population. Most people in a secular age are like, I'm spiritual. Like, I believe there could be a God. I just don't believe in this particular God or the Christian God, right? But everybody in a secular age, they're doubting, and they're also feeling this like loss, this malaise, because there's these big holes that need filling. Do you see how these are doors in our culture to people that are around us? Man, here's a good one. You ready for this one? This is Steve Jobs. This is in his biography by Walter Isaacson. He says, here's a story about Steve Jobs. One sunny afternoon when he wasn't feeling well, Jobs sat in the garden behind his house and reflected on death. He talked about his experience in India almost 4 decades earlier, his study of Buddhism and his views on reincarnation and spiritual transcendence. I'm about 50-50 on believing in God, he said. For most of my life, I felt that there must be more to our existence than meets the eye. He admitted that, as he faced death, he might be overestimating the odds out of a desire to believe in an afterlife. I like to think that something survives after you die, he said. It's strange to think that you accumulate all this experience and maybe a little wisdom and it just goes away. So I really want to believe that something survives, that maybe your consciousness endures. He fell silent for a very long time, but on the other hand, perhaps it's like an on-off switch, he said. Click, and you're gone. Then he paused again and smiled slightly. Maybe that's why I never like to put an on-off switch on an Apple device. And we kind of laugh about this, but here's a guy who all secularists, who all exclusive humanists would say, this guy reached the pinnacle. This is all that secularism and exclusive humanism has to offer, right? You see what I mean? He checks every box of what a secular humanist would say, this is a successful life. Technology, money, happiness, he's got everything. And even at the end of his life, he's saying, I'm 50-50, maybe. But let me tell you, I've lived my whole life with this malaise, with this hole, where I'm like, maybe this is true. I would like for it to be true so much that I'm actually going to structure these technological devices so that there is no on-off switch, so that I'm not living for this moment of just everything going away. Isn't that kind of crazy? Like, this is the example of a person who meets every criteria of a successful life in a secular age, in an exclusive humanist age, who still says, you see 2 things. Do you see the doubt? Do you see the doubt? I'm 50-50. I really would like this to be true. And then do you also see the malaise? Do you see the there's this hole that I really need something to fill, and here I am at the end of my life, and I was not able to fill it with any of the pursuits that the imminent frame or the world around me was able to fill. So I just think this is how a lot of people are. If this is true for Steve Jobs, there's nobody who is achieving less than Steve Jobs in this world that isn't feeling these 2 things, if that makes sense. So briefly, let me just say a couple of things about what this means for evangelism, and then I want to have plenty of time to invite Logan up. I think one of the things we have to realize, this is actually going to be part of our sermon on Sunday, that humans, for all of human history, we make sense of ourselves through stories. The Bible comes to us in a story. The gospel of Jesus comes to us in a story. And actually, one of the things that apologists are saying today is we still love the story of the Bible, even though a lot of people in a secular Western world don't realize that they don't know the story of the Bible, but you know what they love? They love Harry Potter. And on J.K. Rowling's own admission about how she designed Harry Potter, it was designed with sort of this biblical story in mind. The protagonist in the story self-sacrifices and rises from the dead to save other people, and everybody loves Harry Potter. Well, what they don't realize is that this story is based on the biblical gospel story. So people still love the story that the Bible tells. But what's happened in the Western secular age is enlightenment is offering, or secularism is offering, another story. And here's the story that is being told now by the culture, by the secular world, that we have risen to maturity by putting off our childish superstitions and sentimentalities. I'm courageously facing the cold, hard facts of a disenchanted world. It is a story of progress and evolution, so don't be stuck behind in the age of superstitious myths. So what happens in our age, they're telling a story where if you still believe in God and spirits and prayer, it's tantamount to believing in ghosts. It's like, this is stuff that we were able to shed a while back. And so I think that what we need to do or think about is, and realize there's strong pressure to conform. Most people that are buying into the secular story, it's not because they read a lot of scientific studies and studied scientific data. Does that make sense? It's actually the story that's captivating their heart. Well, the Christian faith has a pretty powerful story to share with people, and so I think this we need to offer a better story than that. To go back to what we've already been saying, let me just say this here. I'm going to skip to this very last slide. Okay, here's where we kind of pull it all together. If the big issues, let me say it simply, and then I'll say what's on the slide. If the big issues are disenchantment, to go back to Stephanie's comment earlier, if the big issue is disenchantment, that people are searching for meaning because the world's become disenchanted, and if the other big issue is people are depressed because we've leaned so hard into individualism, you know what might make a huge difference to a lot of people? Is if there were a group of people, a community who welcomed other people in and who really lived as if the world was enchanted. And it's like, oh, maybe that's the church. Right? Maybe the church is the answer all along. If the issue is people are trying to fill a hole that was lost by God and they're lonely and individualist, maybe a group of people who give up their own self-interest in order to love each other and be a community and live as if there is a God and His Son is Jesus Christ, maybe that would make a huge difference in our culture. Does that make sense? But I think what's happening, two things, is that because we are a church in a Western context, we're drinking a lot of this Kool-Aid ourselves, that we're buying into the individualist thing. Do you know how hard it is to get people to sign up for blessed groups? Like, that's the actual place where all this could change, is when people are invited into a community of people that spend a lot of time together and are willing to forego their own individual interests, but I need my time on Sunday afternoon. You see what I'm saying? It's like the reason we're not reaching people is we're buying into the same problems that are keeping them out of church in the first place. Like, we're acting like disenchanted individualists ourselves. So, I mean, this is sort of the real talk of like, if we really wanted to fix it, we would plug the holes. We have the plugs to the holes, Stephanie. Like, we do believe these things, but we're not willing to do what it takes to plug the holes. So, here's the last slide, and then Logan's going to come up. If our current age is disenchanted and searching for meaning and individualistic and lonely and feeling a loss of significance and living in a pluralistic world that's open to different possibilities, then an evangelism that's going to reach those people is going to be a people who live as if the world is enchanted, who really live as if God is real. By the way, this is why hypocrisy is so bad in a secular age. I think hypocrisy is worse in a secular age in a pluralistic society than it is elsewhere. Because if a bunch of people in this one option on the salad bar, I just came up with this. If you go over to the salad bar and all the little cherry tomatoes are rotten, I'm going to stay away from that, right? If all Christians that you know are rotten, then you're going to stay away from that because it's just one of many options. This is why hypocrisy is such a huge deal in this. So you got to have people who actually live it, who really live as if Jesus Christ is the Son of God, who prioritize the church and community over individual, who shows that the Christian story gives us meaning and significance. And then lastly, who invites people to come, taste, and see. What we're going to see next week, Logan's going to teach class next week, I think. And it's going to be on hospitality. And the reason hospitality is so important in a secular age is because you have to create the space for people to come and experience people who believe a world is enchanted in a community. Does that make sense? You have to, if the issue is sharing stories with people, you have to create space to share stories. So hospitality is like the thing when we're talking about evangelism in a pluralized secular. So we want to create environments where I do think this last thing is also a shift in perspective. It's a shift in perspective from let me tell you the right answer to let me invite you to walk alongside me and tell you how my faith gives me meaning and significance. I want you to come taste and experience what has given me meaning. Does that make sense? That's a shift. But one more thing, Stephanie. This is so much easier and it takes a burden off, because a lot of people are saying what you were saying earlier, where if evangelism is let me tell you all the answers, we never do it because none of us have them. But if evangelism's actually like, come walk alongside me as I struggle myself and let me tell you how the Christian faith is making sense for me, I think all of us in this room could do that. Like, that's much more doable than let me tell you every answer to every major question, right? So I think this is encouraging. It's like, yes, there are some depressing things about our culture, but actually there are some open doors. There's some doors that are cracking open here, and evangelism, I think, is a little bit easier. So, Logan, come on up. Let's do some Q&A.
It's not exactly that they don't care about the right answer, but it's just way further down the line, I think.
Yeah. Yes. Keith's asking, is it that they don't care about the right answer, or is it just that that caring about the right answer is way further down the line? One of the things in the sermon this past Sunday, we talked about hypocrisy. And Josh Chatraw in this book, he says, so here's a guy who spends his life trying to minister to young people, apologetics. He says, anytime a young person comes up to me and says, I don't believe in God because of evolution or in science and faith, he says, I never try to start talking about the evidences. He says, I just start asking questions, because what you will find out is that those responses are usually a front for the real answer, which is the church that I grew up at, the pastor sexually abused someone, and my mother, there's some story there. And those actual evidence things are usually a front for something else. And so it's not that those are unimportant, but he says actually usually there's a lot deeper stuff going on. And so he says you don't avoid doing the evidences and answer stuff, but usually they're fronts for something else. Are you monitoring Facebook? You are? Okay.
Yeah.
Is anybody asking anything, or anybody in the room?
I've seen several hands go up in the room in the past
Okay.
couple minutes, so maybe we can field those. And yeah, I've got my phone with me for Facebook, so online folks, post some questions if you've got them.
I was just gonna make a quick comment. I think kids now are struggling more and much more depressed than even when I was a kid,
Yeah.
15 years ago or so.
Yeah, so Wes is making an observation that kids today seem to be struggling more than even when Wes was a kid just a little while ago.
But going back to, being able to let your guard down a little bit, when I was in youth ministry, I felt like there was this barrier until I, let out all the struggles that I had. And it was like the floodgates opened up. And I almost feel like until you can lead on any type of struggles that you've had, I would say 90% of kids now, there's very little struggle.
Yeah, Wes is saying when he worked with kids in youth ministry and churches, it was at the moment that he opened up about his own struggles that the kids it was like a floodgate. But in an individualist culture where we are inside of ourselves, everybody's got struggles. And this is why in our culture, authenticity is so important. And Taylor actually says we're an age of authenticity, where it's be yourself, open up about yourself. And that is where you feel valued, is when people know who's on the inside. And so that is really important. Deontay?
Earlier you mentioned, talked about how the atheists are very small percentage.
Yeah.
So I was curious to know that the atheists aren't sort of like dominating this atmosphere here. Like, what would we call that? Would that be like theists or agnostics?
Deontay's saying earlier we referenced that atheists are actually a small percent of the population. So what do we call other people who are like living as if there's no God? Deists or agnostics? Yeah, when we refer to atheists, we're referring to people who have a really strong belief and say they're really confident there is no God. There's not very many of those people. Even, I'm thinking of Bart Ehrman, who's like the leading Christian skeptic who goes around and tries to convince everybody not to be a Christian. He's very adamant that I do not call myself an atheist. He says I call myself an agnostic, because he says it's impossible to be an atheist. He says it's impossible to prove God exists, but it's also impossible to prove God doesn't exist. So he says anybody that calls themselves an atheist is just not being honest.
Mm-hmm.
which is an interesting thing, which means the vast majority of people, Deontay, are like in the middle. They're just kind of, so what do we call them? I don't know.
The statistics, will sometimes refer to them as the nuns, or more formally as the religiously non-affiliated, which is a mouthful. But to your point, those people believe there is a God, have a spirituality, feel a deep connection with beauty and nature and all these things.
And they may not believe there's a God per se, but they believe in some kind of power.
Yeah,
like,
that's what they would mean.
We see a lot of people in our culture that believe in power
sort
or
of
spiritual
lowercase
power.
G
Or,
God,
I go to my Friday night gemstone, power healing club or whatever. Like those things are happening all over the place, right?
Like a common phrase in people my age is, instead of like I'll pray for you, is I'm sending you good vibes. Mm-hmm. That's sort of the stand-in for just acknowledging a spirituality and still trying to connect with somebody. So can I say one thing about this that is important? Taylor makes some predictions about what's going to continue to happen in the West. He thinks, now remember, he's still alive. He's an older guy now, but he thinks that what happens is when you begin to see the current framework start to get cracks because it just can't hold together and make sense of life and reality, that it causes people to get creative and invent new things. And he thinks that we're already seeing the cracks of exclusive humanism. That like our generation, young people, are like, I need some kind of power. I need some vibes. I need somebody to send me vibes. Like if exclusive humanism's right and this is all there is, that's not going to work. It doesn't make sense of life. This is why a lot of young people are spiritual. They're just not religious. They're already seeking for that next thing. And so his prediction is that in the next coming generations, now we may not be alive, because remember, we're talking about things that have happened over 500 years. Like I may be dead before this, but there will be inventions of new things, like new ways of holding on to transcendence and enchantment and being individualists.
If we're created in the image of God, then they're always going to be seeking and searching and never satisfied.
Yeah, Stephanie's saying if we're created in the image of God, then there'll always be seeking and searching. Absolutely.
It's a God-sized hole.
Yes.
Put God in it.
But what I hope you saw last week was that exclusive humanism was a really creative way to try to fill that. Because it's a viewpoint that's never existed in all of human history and doesn't exist in anywhere outside of the West today. And what he's saying is, as people are trying to fill that hole, they will get more creative. They may not turn back to God. He says they could. Like we could have some kind of revival where people, want to turn back to God. But more than likely, we'll see more inventive creations that our people are grasping to try to fill this. They just don't want to fill it with God.
So those are the people that, when I was growing up, my grandmother would say, well, they're good people. They might not have attended any religious service or
Yeah.
they were good people.
Yeah, so Charles Taylor and a bunch of other philosophers and scholars, there's a guy whose name is slipping my mind right now, who've argued one of the things that happened in the last 500 years in the West is that especially the secular humanists, they got the idea to like love and care and social justice from the Christian faith. Like you will never be able to remove kind of Christian roots from the Western world. Like Christianity is what starts science, the Enlightenment. All the early scientists, like Galileo, all those guys, they were Christians. So like Christians got all this started, then they just removed God and Christianity from it, but they still want to claim the morals that Christians kind of instilled in the Western society. And so, I think that's one of the things that goes on is that you're saying, okay, how does my neighbor know to be a good person, and why do they actually look so much like a Christian even though they don't go to church? Well, that happened because our culture was formed on these kind of Western values, our Christian values. We just removed God from those.
So let me say, to your point, Garrett, that younger people, like even my age, are searching for a re-enchanted environment.
Yeah.
A movement I see that may be a surprise to a lot of you is young Christians like me moving to what I might call like a high church setting. So instead of a more congregational setting like us, they might go to a Catholic church or a Presbyterian church, because those are more enchanted environments. Like you ever walk into a Catholic cathedral, it's beautiful. There's art everywhere. like to feel that organ in your chest is a sort of stirring thing. So we ask the question, like, where are young people going? It's not that all young people are going to the secular world in their search for re-enchantment. A certain portion of them are just going to these more high church settings that embrace beauty and art and creativity. And so I think the challenge for us is maybe we can be an environment that welcomes those who connect with God through art and beauty and creativity. I wouldn't say that Churches of Christ or even Oliver Creek is a place where people can do that very easily.
Yeah, Logan's exactly right. I mean, I have friends, just a local Memphis. There was a Church of Christ youth minister in Memphis who was very public a couple of years ago about leaving Churches of Christ in order to go to a high church setting. This is a major trend among young people who are serious about their faith, that they're seeking these higher church traditions, Anglicanism, Catholicism, where they can go and have liturgies, and it's very counterintuitive to maybe that may surprise some of you, but it is happening. It's statistically happening.
Yeah, so the question then is, we've talked a lot about sort of people plugging their hearts. Instead of saying, God proves that these plugs you're using, like art and movies and politics, God proves that those are irrelevant. Instead, what if we say, no, God proves that those are relevant. And instead of those being plugs, what if they're open doors or pipelines? And instead of stopping up your heart to what's outside in the world, we actually use politics and movies and music as a way to connect people with God. I think that's the way that it has to happen in our world. It's almost like, since we're here, we can't go back, and we've got to figure out how to work within it, you know?
Yeah. That's actually what Josh Chatrall says in his book. He says that you have to find these sparks of people where they encounter that kind of divinity, that kind of feeling of transcendence, and you have to capitalize on those sparks. And he says art and beauty is one of those ways to do it. It's that same feeling that you get when you look at the Grand Canyon, or you look at all the azalea bushes blooming, or whatever around town here. You get that feeling, and that leads you to kind of reflect and worship God. Well, other people get that feeling about seeing those same things. It just doesn't automatically lead them to worship God. So do you see how that's like beauty and art becomes a way actually to step in and talk to people and kind of help them make that connection that you're making yourself? Yeah. Raymond?
What are the people who they act spiritual, they say they believe in God, they believe in Jesus, and this enchantment, they have some of that, but they don't like the Bible.
Yeah, that's a tough one. People who say they believe in God and Jesus but don't like the Bible. That's a tough one.
Well, I think the wrong thing to do would be spend all your time trying to prove to them that the Bible is the first place they should look. That's a conversation that needs to happen at some point in that relationship, but I think you've got to connect with them where they're at.
I think it also goes to Sunday morning. One of the things that we could do if we invite them into community and they begin to experience God, as they see you're living out, Raymond makes it possible for me to maybe think the Bible might be true. If Raymond can live like this and be so kind and loving, if that book made him be like this, then your life actually makes believing in the Bible plausible. Whereas it wasn't before. Actually, the way we live creates a new plausibility structure for people to say, maybe there is something to this. So we talk about plausibility structures a lot, which is if you have no framework to think this is a workable way, you're not going to live that way. But if somebody gives you a new framework that says, oh, this is possible to be loving and a good person and have community and worth and meaning, and then maybe I will be willing to give the Bible a second look. Is anybody online commenting?
Got a
Okay,
couple.
go ahead.
I was going to say, I've heard it the opposite way also. There's a soldier who was published as an atheist.
Bible and all that, I'm just not for the church. And so that's but he had a story in his background where he was really hurt by church. So yeah, that's a common story. What were you going to ask?
I was curious to know your thoughts
So he's asking about capitalism and how does capitalism influence secularism. I have some initial thoughts that we don't have time to address philosophically capitalism. But I'd say, Charles Taylor says there's some real downsides to living in a secular age. We all experience those. It's what frustrates us most about our culture. But also, I wouldn't want to go back to 1500. So you got to kind of deal with what you got. I'd also say when you look at other cultures today in other parts of the world that don't have the same kind of capitalist society that we do, there are things about those cultures that I'm really envious of. Did anybody hear Emmanuel Madu that night? It's like, I long for that kind of church experience, right? There are things about that I really long for, but there's also things, if I were to move to Africa today, that would be very shocking to me and would be very hard to, you see what I'm saying? There's always positives, there's always negatives. So what I would say is there are some positives that come along with capitalism, but there are also some really big negatives, and we're seeing it tonight. Capitalism has learned how to latch onto consumerism and entertainment and individualism and disenchantment, and we're experiencing a lot of the real negative effects of that, but that doesn't necessarily mean I'd like to be transported to the Middle East, right now. So I would just say I think it's a mixed bag. One of the things that I think is sad is that if Christians can't be, we're part of another kingdom. That's where our ultimate citizenship is. And when Christians can't critique the bad things about the earthly kingdoms that they live in, that's where we're really... So because capitalism has now become this thing that you can't say anything negative about, I think that's what's really problematic. Yes, and we got to do some online because we're out of questions. Yes, go ahead, Wes.
Well, I was going to say on that, I think capitalism has been aligned with Christianity in some cases. I see people saying if you aren't a staunch believer in capitalism,
Yeah.
then that's the equivalent of going to hell.
Right.
I mean, you're coming from somebody who didn't have capitalism. My business really feels
Yeah.
really big.
So Wes is saying he sees some Christians aligning capitalism with the Christian faith, and that's what I'm saying is problematic when we do that, because we should be able to critique from a God-centered perspective anything that happens in the kingdom of the world.
Here's a good question from Maggie online. She says, so how do we shore up the faith and truth of our teens and young adults who are confronted on a daily basis with peers who reject the truth? Group mentality is a strong pull, and there are more unchurched than churched in society.
Yeah, I would say what our teens are doing right now in the back. They're studying, they're doing this series. What's it called? Do you remember? It's you can ask questions or have doubts.
Can I ask that?
Can I ask that?
Yeah.
And it's about, they're asking really big, hard questions, and Luke's addressing that with them. And Luke has reached out to the elders and ministers and help us talk with our teens. So he's creating an atmosphere. But here,
I've got two thoughts about it that I'll share when you're done.
Okay, sorry. But that's because Luke reads and knows the literature and has a good sense on what Charles Taylor is. Mm-hmm. And so at Oliver Creek, Luke is doing a good job preparing our kids to enter that world. What's happening at a lot of churches today is the youth ministers are coming right out of undergrad. Do you think they've engaged with Charles Taylor? Do you think they have any sense of what's going on? So what happens in a lot of youth ministry programs is you make sure that your calendar is just completely packed with youth rallies and activities and sports days and waters days and lock-ins and all this stuff. Do you think that prepares them in an individualist secular world? Actually, it's feeding into some of that stuff because it's just entertainment, right? So actually, I'm saying I'm really happy with what's happening here. I think that Luke is doing a really good job. I think our other leaders involved in the youth program are doing a better job. I don't think that's happening in a lot of other churches. And so if we look at the future, I think it probably does look bleak because I think a lot of youth ministries are actually built around playing into individualism and entertainment.
Yeah, so if the question is how do we help our young people not be pulled away by the secular world? Well, of course the answer is help them embrace this community of believers. But when we come together as a community of believers, it has to be a space where young people can connect with God and sort of fill that hole that they're feeling. And so a sort of lifeless, cold, hard worship service or a Bible class is actually going to be dissatisfying, especially to young people. So there has to be time for quietness and silence. There has to be time for confession and vulnerability. And of course, scripture reading and singing and things like that. And we don't always have all those ingredients as a part of our worship gatherings, which is why they can be discouraging to young people. But that's the case for all of us, right? Like, what's the number one reason people say they love worship at Oliver Creek on a Sunday morning? It's the singing, right? We connect with that sort of enchanted moment. So that's one thing. The other is, when they're not with a community of believers, they've got to be equipped for those moments as well. And I think the biggest answer is we have to equip our young people to practice spiritual disciplines. These are like little ways to create pockets of enchantment in our lives, little ways to connect with God through meditation, through fasting, through prayer, through silence, things like this. And so we have to equip our people. Here's how you do this, and here's what it's going to look like when you're not with a community of believers. And that's something that all of us need to know how to do as well.
Do you remember when I was sharing that research where church attendance held steady for 60 years that Gallup was recording it beginning in the 1930s, but then in the early 2000s it's just dropped 23%? Early 2000s are also when social media happened. And I don't think that we I think we all have a sense that something major has happened since social media happened, but I don't even think we are beginning to understand the way that that's affecting kids. So everybody in here, we're secular and we're part of the Western water, but I don't even think we're beginning to understand how social media is affecting them. And this is why young kids are more depressed than any other generation, where there's all these high rates of suicide, because what that phone in your pocket does is it now brings secularism literally into your pocket. And it's driving you more into yourself, although it's proclaiming this is an opportunity for you to get more connected. It's not. Why do we have so much bullying today? You know where you don't get bullied? In a non-individualistic society. In communal societies, you take care of each other and you make sure nobody gets bullied. You know what I'm saying? Like, all the problems that we're having are individualism, and we put these devices in their pockets now that are just projecting all of these problems. This is why I think something radical is happening just in the last 2 decades that is much faster. And our phones, our social media accelerated changes that have taken 500 years to get here. Now that amount of change is happening within decades. But the research, again, once you realize what's going on, nothing is groundbreaking. So the research says that if you want kids to remain faithful, here's the 2 most important things. The 2 most important things, sticky faith. There's all this research that's done over a decade. The 2 most important things is mom and dad take their faith seriously. Big shocker, right? And then number 2, if they have at least 5 connections in the church community that share their faith and invest in the kids.
Especially intergenerational.
Intergenerational, yeah, older relationships. It's like, big shocker. If the problem is individualism, we're all lonely and depressed, like, what would happen if a community radically gathered around our kids to raise them together? Does that make sense? Like, it just, I see that research on it. Duh! You know, if these are the problems, like, these fixes are pretty easy. So I know we're out of time and we could just keep going, but anyway, I really appreciate this. Next week, Logan's going to do hospitality. And by the way, later on, I'm going to go ahead and put a couple of bugs in your ears. Here's 2 bugs. One is, after this class, we're going to do a class on talking about the evidences and the questions that we're going to submit to you, and we're going to try to, the people that are investing themselves in the Wednesday class, you get the first pick of the litter here. But we're going to give you 12 questions, and they're like, has science disproved faith? What about all the war and genocide? I don't remember what all 12 they are. I'm not spending 3 months talking about the biggest, hardest questions in all of life in the Bible, so we're going to narrow it down to 6. You're going to get to vote on what 6 we cover in this class. So I'm excited about that. But the second thing I want to plug later on is every topic that we're talking about secularism, and then next week hospitality, and then having hard conversations with people and all these things. At the end of this class, Deontay is going to teach the class. He's going to share a story, because this class is Deontay's story. Like, he came to faith as an adult, and it was through the influence of someone who was asking him hard questions. And so what we're talking about is not just some crazy theoretical thing. Like, there's one of them right there. Like, he's also on staff here at Oliver Creek. So it works. It's not just like this invented stuff. So I'm super pumped about that and super pumped to hear Deontay share that with us in a couple of weeks. So
The teens are getting like an extra half hour. They're like in class till 8. So
yeah, so Keith is letting everybody know that, I don't know if you know this, but after this class ends, the parents of the teens, they have to sit around for another 30 minutes because the teens don't just meet for 1 hour, they meet for an hour and a half. Yeah, Keith is saying we should keep going, but this is part of it. Like, how do we ensure that teens stay faithful? Like, that's it. It's happening back there right now. It's just people who are bringing their kids to somebody who knows what they're talking about and is also understanding culture, like Luke, but then taking them home and living in a house where mom and dad model faith, and then being a part of a church community that takes living for the Lord seriously. Those are the answers, I think. It's not super hard. It's hard to do. It's hard to find a church like that, but the ideas are not super hard. Let me end on a prayer, and then we'll be dismissed. Father, thank you for this time we've had to come together tonight to think about these big topics, our world, our culture, and ultimately what we want is we want to see more people come to know you. We want to win as many as we can by our lives, by our actions in our community. Please help us to have hearts to seek and save those in our world who are lost. But right now, what we're praying for is not just to have hearts, but fill us with wisdom and guidance on how best to do that. We want to do that in the most effective way so that we see our neighbors and coworkers and friends and families come to know and serve and love Jesus Christ. And so we pray all this now in the name of Jesus. Amen.